Hi, my name is Kevin Leahy. I'm the Global General Manager of the Data Center Practice here at Dimension Data. And joining me today is Manuvir, who is joining us from EMC, where he's the Senior Vice President of the Advanced Software Division. And what we want to talk about today is a topic that's near and dear to everyone's heart. Managed storage, automation. How do you get your arms around this environment? How do you actually start to tackle the challenges that the massive data growth that we're all experiencing, and actually start to get the value out of this? It's all about corporate value in the end, and what we're really trying to think about then is how do you approach it? As I work with clients around the world, we see regularly that everyone's done I wouldn't say a great job, but an admirable job of attacking the costs in their server side. They've done a great job working with VMware, who's obviously part of the EMC Alliance, but they've really only addressed that side. And even some of the most advanced clients, when I step back and talk to them, they haven't really started to look at the storage environment. Yet the storage spend outpaces the server spend by almost 5x. And then they start to realize there's all these new sources of data, all these new points of value of data that they've never done before. They had a pretty good model when the world was structured data. They understood how to do it. They had their own BI modules. They had all sorts of things. But the advent of big data, the advent of new sources and types of data, whether it's images, whether it's files, or just massive streams of incoming social media trends, could be any number of things. But all this data has different life value and may be extremely important at the moment. It may be unimportant 5 minutes later, or it may be something that seems unimportant at the moment, and then 3 years down the road you find out, wow, I have to go back and look at this. And things like healthcare, they're starting to go backwards and look at, what were the indicators 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago that we should have seen? And how do I build patterns out of that? So it's not all well understood. It's really this emerging area where a lot of expense, massive growth, unaddressed market in many ways in terms of really exploiting it. And so the question is, how do you approach it? And that's what we're going to try and spend a little bit of time on today. So it starts with the very obvious point of you can't do it the way you've been doing it before. You can't just statically keep everything in the same place on your tier 1 disk, which had one very, very large finance customer said, we just keep everything forever. Now, as a supplier of storage, and certainly Manuvir representing EMC would love that. Just keep buying. That's great. We don't advise it, but we wouldn't mind it. The real question is, how do you do this smart? How do you start to approach this? And there's lots of challenges as people have come down through here. In many cases, we've all heard the promise of ILM, Information Lifecycle Management. We've heard it for a decade or more. But it's not unusual to go into most clients and find out, I don't have an information policy. And my IT has never really talked to the business and saying what's important and for how long. And that just the communication is a starting point. But let's assume they do communicate. That's a big assumption, but let's assume they do. What has to happen next? Well, then you have to build policy. You actually have to have rules and procedures that say, what information do I care about? How am I going to keep it? For how long? What are the governance rules that sit around it? Where can it sit? I had one client, a bank in New York, was looking at fraud. And they went and found out that the first fraud, the largest fraud example they had, was $50,000 valued beneficiaries of insurance. That's the largest piece. Now, they could find that, but they couldn't import all the data into one place because of compliance rules. They had to find it locally. They had to find it where the data was gathered, or they would never spot those kinds of patterns. Because rules say what information can leave a country, what private information can be moved. So there's all these different procedures around here. Now, to expect someone manually to do this the way things used to be done is, beyond the dream of impossible. So you really start to say, what's the approach I'm going to take here? What's the new things of data that I might decide to integrate, 2 years from now, go back and connect these two things as applications become more advanced and new ways of exploiting value become important. So clearly hardware is not going to get it done. Right? You have to have a better approach. You have to have a more holistic approach. And really think about, how are you going to take that on? So obviously it always starts with technology. So I thought, first good part of this discussion is, turn it over to Manuvir and say, obviously EMC saw this coming. Well, what were the issues that you saw in terms of the traditional hardware approach to doing things versus what's the art of the possible? We've all heard about software-defined, software-driven. What did you see as the opportunity, and where did you see technology going that help us get there? So start to address the problem.
Yeah, Kevin, I think that's a great question, and yeah, I'm fortunate to be working in a place where we talk to a lot of our customers are people who run IT shops, right? In enterprises and at service providers. So everything we do is really driven by the input we get from them, the problems we see them trying to solve. And the way I would break it down from a technology point of view is that really we saw I would say two requirements and probably one constraint that was arising for IT. The requirements were firstly, as you said, because of the explosion of data, scale, right? That there's a lot of solutions and systems, hardware-based, that work very, very well when you have 100 terabytes or 500 terabytes or a petabyte, but they break down when you're trying to do much more data, like 10 petabytes or 50 petabytes, because you just don't get the efficiency and the cost is very high. And then the other requirement we got as a theme from all of this is basically agility. And the thing you said about policy and sort of the interaction between IT and the business, I would describe that as a requirement we got on agility, which is basically we see more and more IT organizations feeling the pressure from the public cloud, where the business units within the companies are saying, well, if I go to the public cloud, I can get what I need very quickly. And I can be flexible, I can choose different options. Whereas when I go to my in-house IT, things happen very slow, and I open tickets and it takes months for me to get stuff back. And I cannot really have a model where, I have a mental model of what I want and it just gets done. I have to think very physically and mechanically about exactly what I want. So those are really the two requirements that we saw. And then the constraint that came with that was, of course, the public cloud vendors have made quite a few strides in this area, the Amazons, Microsofts, Googles. But I think what you see there, and certainly I had some personal experience with on the Microsoft side, when you do public cloud, you sort of have the luxury of starting from scratch. And you take your empty data center and you build everything the way you want to build it. Whereas almost all the customers we talk to from EMC have stuff already sitting in the data centers, right? Have systems in which one has made a lot of investments. And so you can't actually do that. So the constraint is solve these two requirements for me, give me systems that work well at scale, and give me agility, but don't make me throw away everything that I've already got, right? Those are the things that we've heard. And specifically I guess I would couch the problem from IT as keep me relevant in the future model for my business units instead of them running somewhere else. And I think to your point about the policy, what that really comes down to is the right interaction model you want to have is systems whereby application owners can describe what they want. Right? Like, this is the kinds of data I have. These are the requirements I have, that this kind of data I want to keep around for a certain amount of time. This other data I don't, etc. And give me a system from IT where I can just specify that policy, and then let IT, using all the software that vendors like EMC can provide, translate that down to the physics of, okay, this means I need a storage array like this over here. I need to provision some volumes there. I need to do something over here. I need a data migration that'll move this amount of data from here to here. I need to enable this kind of fast policy or tiering or whatever. You don't really want the business units and the application owners to have to think about that. They should be able to think very logically about what they want, and then IT should be able to implement that very quickly. And I think that's where software-defined solutions come in, because in the software, you can build all these algorithms that basically translate the policy that an application owner wants into the mechanics of what is done in the systems underneath in an automated fashion. That's basically what we've seen in terms of the movement in IT and the approach we've taken at EMC, and certainly we're not unique in this. And I think rather than talking about EMC products, I would just make the general point here that what software can do is software can be very nimble about implementing algorithms that do different things, new things every day. And our approach has been to take software and write software that says we will give you a way to specify in a logical way what you want to achieve. And at the same time, we understand what assets you have in the environment very well. And our algorithms will translate the policy that you want down into the mechanics of what should be set up on the different systems, what volume should be provisioned where, what replication should be set up where. And this is all done automatically by the algorithms and software. And so it scales better, it's more reliable, and it can be arbitrarily intelligent. And so that's really what we've tried to do.
Excellent. So you hit a couple of very core points. I guess the only one I'll challenge is I suspect everyone on this call who's taking the time to listen wants to be more than relevant. I think they want to provide real business value. And so I think they're looking for a lot more than that. The business wants a lot more than that from that. They want, how do I get more value? And I think they've been frustrated working with the mechanical, manual tasks that prevented them actually looking at the business value of the information rather than just keeping track of where the information resided. But you hit a couple of points that I think were very, very critical. And one step I would just make a key point about here is I think what we've learned as you looked at the early days of hardware virtualization, when they started, the vendors would be out there saying, keep everything as close to the metal was the term they used to use, right? And the idea being that this introduction of the abstraction layer created so much performance overhead you wouldn't do it. So keep everything close to the metal. The result of that was you were stuck, right? And every technology had its own domain of tools and technology requirements. Those days are gone. And the key, what we've learned working with clients, if you want to automate, you have to be able to extend the value of the automation across the entire infrastructure. And that requires an abstraction layer.
Yes.
And I think architecturally, it's really important as we work with clients to say, where is the layer around which you want to build your value and your services? We see in an SDN as well, right? You hear the concept of northbound and southbound APIs, so that this conversation is relevant, whether it's storage, whether it's computer, whether it's networking. But defining what layer around which you want to make the connection to the business seems to be important. And then putting in an abstraction layer such that everything below this, right, you don't have to worry about keeping pace with technology. You need to introduce that capability, and then you focus, whoever the you is, whether it's us to mention data or them, the client who's listening to this call right now, says this is where I'm going to make my investment in terms of defining those policies. And I think that architectural element is important to create that abstraction layer. How have you addressed that, and what are you seeing in terms of the ability to really drive a heterogeneous environment?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Kevin. And my personal background is I started my career I did my PhD in compilers and programming languages. So I'm all about abstraction, right? And the lesson I learned from working on compilers was, you had all these different kinds of processors, right? And the way you made a compiler fly is that you had sort of a plug-in model which says, depending on the kind of processor that this computer has, I'm going to generate different kind of assembly code or whatever to run on that processor, right? And then I spent some years working on Windows, which had the same kind of model for device drivers, right? Which is that you've got one operating system that needs to work on a plethora of different kinds of equipment, and so you build a nice plug-in device driver model that is, again, just another form of abstraction, right? And so I think that's exactly the approach that we believe in, and certainly from EMC, that's fundamentally the approach that we've taken, which is to say, in the software layer, you do two things. One is you have a consistent northbound API, which is completely independent of the hardware you've got underneath, the storage systems you've got underneath. That northbound API is exposing capabilities of things you want to do, like create classes of service and describe, replication policies and compliance policies and retention policies. And then there's a southbound sort of plug-in model where regardless of which vendor produced, some array, whether it's a Hitachi or a Dell device or an EMC device or whatever, you can very quickly spin up new drivers and plug in support for those arrays underneath, so that in a heterogeneous environment, for the application owner, for the business, even for the IT administrator, once you wired up the environment you have, a lot of the work you do is at a level where you're not really worrying about the differences between different kinds of hardware and different kinds of devices, right? And it's only in that lower layer where you've got these plugins that you handle different devices. And I think I would say in that direction, I think a really important trend in the industry, which started with a number of people who worked in the open source world, and now certainly EMC, if I may make a plug, has totally embraced that model, is to make this kind of software layer as open as possible, right, in an open source model, so that that sort of plug-in driver model that allows you to handle heterogeneous environments is as accessible as possible. So every vendor, every developer, every IT shop, like I look at a big uh, partner like Dimension Data that has so many clients and different environments. If Dimension Data wants to support a different piece of hardware for a particular client's environment, then the developers at Dimension Data themselves can go in and create new plugins or what have you, right? That's the kind of model we want to foster, I think, in the industry. It also leads to some kind of standardization, because everybody who's relying on this kind of technology knows what's in there, can see what's in there, can depend on the fact that the community is taking it forward together, right? So I think that's the general model. The northbound API is independent of the hardware. The southbound API is this plugin model. And Kevin, the final thing I would say is, to your point about being close to the metal, I think what's fundamentally changed that makes this model viable now is that a lot of what I'm talking about is happening not on the data I/O path, where you care about introducing 100 microseconds of latency through some abstraction layer, but it's happening on the control path, on the management path, where you're deciding where to create the next volume and which replication group to create and policy kinds of things, right? So you're not really paying a performance penalty for introducing this abstraction layer in the middle. So.
Oh, that's great. A couple of things. I just want to make sure I make notice of the fact that if there are any questions, certainly feel free to post them on the event page, or using the DD Hangouts hashtag. You certainly can post them either now, or even if you're looking at the recording, you can post questions there, and either Manuvir Das or myself, Kevin Leahy, or any of our teams will respond to you, regardless of whenever you see this recording. So please don't hesitate to ask questions in a short hangout. We can only get through so much material. But Manuvir, you made a couple of points there which I think are just so critical. One is really this notion of supporting the new trends. And I'll tell you, we had a recent example, and obviously we're a big partner of EMC, so we've used some of your software as we've built out a managed service. But we had a recent example where a data center in Texas was having problems, and they needed really higher speed storage to address the problem, massive scale for a particularly intensive environment. And in traditional model, that particular client said, there's no way we can absorb this, right? We're not able to manage this environment. And because we had introduced that abstraction layer, we said we can introduce that right away. Right? We didn't have to change any of our operational processes or any of our procedures. It simply was just support of another technology, but everything else to us looked and felt the same. But that's true across all the reams of technology. And I'd say one area where I say that clients really need to make their own personal investment, and we'll talk about operations in a few minutes, but their own personal investment is understanding the business value of data. And one thing I've seen is there's this idea that policies need to be complex. They don't necessarily need to be complex, but they definitely need to be defined. And you think about, life cycle of healthcare information, right? Of the value and the speed at which it needs to be available while the patient's in the hospital is quite different than what you're going to retain it at over the life of that patient over the, perhaps 100 years. And so where and how important that value is of the data changes at a period of time. So simple policies, I particularly worked with one client who was a carrier in Italy, and their example was they were buying tier 1 storage like it was going out of style. And I said, well, what happens to all that image data on the contracts their customers signed? Well, they kept it all, right? Signed a new contract, the old one, and the one after that, and one after that stayed on tier 1 data. So what about a simple policy that says, after the new contract signed, take the old stuff and move it out to tier 2 or 3? For 9 months, they didn't have to buy any tier 1 storage. It was that simple. And that's not a complex policy.
Correct.
So I'd like to turn over to you, Manuvir, and say, what are the kinds of policies and the kinds of things that businesses need to decide around business value, and how complex are those algorithms they need to write to support that? Or is this really something that they're more fearful of than practically is actually that difficult to achieve?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, from EMC's point of view, we have an interesting perspective on this because we're also heavily involved in the backup and data protection business, right? Where this comes to the forefront a lot. I think I'm continually amazed, Kevin, by how much opportunity is left on the table because, as you said, customers could be doing very simple things to save themselves a lot of cost. And it's just, it's probably lack of insight into how to get this done, right? Like we routinely see examples where people have expensive database environments, and we know about them because they bought backing storage from EMC for the databases, and they've got, all this unstructured image data or whatever sitting, as first-class data in those databases, going to this expensive high-end storage, and there's absolutely no need for that, right? That data could be moved on. So I think the real reason, right? So if you think about, you were right earlier, Kevin, when you said that I was remiss in focusing more about staying on the aspect of staying relevant. And really, the reason we went and built all this software stuff was because it's a journey, and I think of it as a two-stage journey. The first stage that we were very focused on the last few years with our customers was get people to that point where they buy into automation and abstraction, so that a lot of tasks that are mundane, repetitive tasks today and that are complex because of heterogeneity sort of go off the table, right? And once they go off the table, that opens up opportunity to do new things for business value. And what we have really built, the way to think about it, is a software layer that is an engine for orchestration and automation. Okay, and so what that means is that as you go forward now, you introduce new kinds of business problems that you solve with orchestration and automation. One of those is basically intelligent data placement, right? So I've got different kinds of storage assets that have different cost factors and that come with different SLAs as to what they can do, what the performance is, etc., right? And now I can take advantage of these assets to do tiering, right? And decide which data moves where, right? And the policies that I want to set, from my application are generically in terms of things that I can observe in the infrastructure in my software that the application owner doesn't really have to worry about, which is things like how recently was that data accessed, right? So the typical kind of model that you think about in caching, least recently used, etc., right? With the software layer that we put in the data center, where we watch all the way from the host where the application is running through the network to the backend storage, it's very easy for us to track what data was accessed when. And so that makes it possible to automate this kind of policy which says, okay, data that hasn't been touched in the last, week, we will determine that that's cold data and we'll move it off to cheaper storage, right? And the interesting thing is, I think a lot of the hardware and the storage devices and systems have now evolved to the point, Kevin, where they have primitive mechanisms that one can call into to do the data movement, right? And so the software layer on top can watch the traffic across the application stack, make judgments about what's cold, and then trigger that movement for the systems underneath to say move the data, right? So I think with that kind of thing that we're building for the client who's got the applications or the IT shop, even though underneath something complex is going on, you don't have to worry about that complexity and you don't have to think about that. You think at a very high level, which says, okay, my policies, the way this set of applications work, once a week has passed and this data hasn't been touched, that means it's not going to be that interesting to me, right? And everything else from there is going to be done, automatically by the system underneath, right? So I think there's a significant opportunity there. I think folks like EMC who have worked on building these software layers, and certainly we are not alone, others have done that. I think that's the real promise, as you said. This business of introducing the automation and abstraction to make mundane tasks on heterogeneous things become simpler and quicker is just step one. And it's just sort of establishing a baseline to reduce some of the chaos that we have today around storage infrastructure. And the real reason for doing all this is because it opens up the possibilities, right? Like you think about software-defined networking. Once I can program everything, I can be very creative about how I create VLANs and how I mix and match my networking, right? And it's the same kind of thing here. So I think the truth of the matter is that without the application owner knowing about it, through very simple policy settings, it is possible for the software layer to be pretty intelligent about how to identify and find when data should be tiered, what data should be tiered, and I think there's real opportunity for savings and efficiency there.
So I think some important points there as well, and just a couple of things I want to say. And creative sounds great, and when we started in the cloud world, everyone gave developers free license. Just go out and develop in the cloud, and it was great. The change, though, was the move when you said, well, let's move those applications into production.
Yeah.
And operational processes, production processes came to fore. And I think that's one of the areas where we see clients challenging and why we've made the investment in building out an automated managed environment is there's some conflicting things at play. One is I want to enable the creativity, but honestly, I've got corporate value. I've got critical corporate assets. It's not the compute, it's the data that's a critical corporate asset. And so I don't want too much creativity into where that goes, whose hands it is, how long it sits there, I'm able to find it. And so I need a way to do operational processes that are going to span these environments. And the thing that's changed along the way as well is you don't just have tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 data anymore. Well, you got tier 0, which is flash, but you also have the cloud. And so most people we see have had operational processes that did pretty well in their tier 1 storage. The tier 3, the NAS, frankly, was managed by the accountant that happened to be using it. Well, that was fine when it was just local data that sat behind a firewall and it was only useful to him. As it starts to integrate into the business process and the business applications, it's got to be managed more consistently. And then the data that goes in the cloud needs a completely different operational construct. Not that because it's different type of disk, but because I'm going to have very different policies in terms of what data comes from the cloud into my data center, what data from my data center can go to the cloud, and how am I going to govern that? And then somebody's going to come and audit me, and I need to be able to show that life cycle of that data, who's touched it, where it's been, for how long, and all those elements. So we've seen, while all of this technical capabilities come along, we saw a very big gap in terms of how do you operationalize this. And consistency, I would say, we come in and we talk to clients, we have a great tier 1 process, no debate, but haven't extended it to all their tiers and have not even considered how to manage the cloud data in a real and meaningful way. So we invested in that. So that allows clients to then look across that environment. And we found that's very important, and most clients say, wow, I just don't want to spend the year and a half that Dimension Data did to automate out those environments. I want to spend my time defining policies and actually defining what am I going to do with that information? How am I going to get value out of it? How do I integrate it with new application models and new users? And so we've seen this sort of shift internal to the data center, the corporate client saying, I want to focus on that northbound side. I want to focus on the business value element. And you guys take care of the operational processes because I don't have them to span this breadth of environment. And the other thing I would say is typically we are seeing clients saying, we don't have a policy. And so can you share best practices with us? Now, I know we've worked together sort of combining our collective knowledge and what we've learned in managing all these environments globally, along with what you've learned in terms as the sort of largest footprint of storage in the world, and say, how do we take that collective knowledge and create some standard IP so that clients who don't have a policy say, well, here's best practice. And if you have a different policy because you're going to differentiate your business on the value of that, then by all means that can be easily automated and constructed. But start from something, at least start with best practice and get better, versus start with an unknown and what do you do from there? And we've seen that as a sort of a critical success factors. What other critical success factors do you see, Manuvir, as you see clients trying to do this?
Yeah. So I think one thing that we've seen, Kevin, is that when you want to go down this route, you don't want to do everything on day one. So in particular, one of the design principles we've used for all the stuff we've built is that if you go into any environment and you deploy this software and you use it to introduce abstraction and automation, you should be able to pick any subset of your environment to apply this on. Maybe it's some particular application use cases, or it's some number of the assets that you have, or it's even some of the capacity you have within some of the assets, because that way you roll this thing in, you become comfortable with the notion of working at this level of abstraction, and then you kind of go from there, right? I think some of our bigger customers who are now have deployed this thing at large scale. What they did was, they first picked some greenfield applications that they were starting out with, greenfield environments. They put this kind of technology in there. They saw success with that, and then they gradually moved towards the brownfield where they, spread this over more of their existing environments. So I think that kind of staged approach, I think, has been a sort of best practice that's worked really well. That's one. I'd say the other one has been, we really saw, Kevin, in the early days. I think EMC was probably a vendor that got into this very early with some of our products several years ago, and what we found is that there was a real sort of inflection point with almost every one of the first customers we worked with, where in the beginning there was a lot of pushback that, okay, but I used to do the following thing with this spreadsheet where I used to keep all this, and show me what buttons I press and what entries I put in here to do the same thing. And we'd keep going back and forth and saying, no, you actually don't have to do that anymore. You don't have to do this anymore. You don't have to do that anymore. And then at some point you get that inflection where the light goes on and they say, yeah, I get it now, because last night I had this problem and I need to provision some new stuff on some new array, and you know what, I didn't have to do all of that, and it just sort of worked. So I think for customers who go down the route of really adopting the software-defined model to become more efficient at scale and all of that, there's a little bit of you have to understand what you're getting into, and it's not exactly like what you've had before, right? And you really have to get that. It's like, all the people in my city driving these Tesla electric cars these days, which is, very great technology, but it's different. Right? You got to understand that it's different, and you can't drive into a gas station and fill up your tank. So you got to know what you're getting into and why you're getting into it. I think is the other thing that I would point out.
Great, I think that's great advice. I think you've hit a couple of really core ones. I think it actually mimics the operational side very, very much, which is, look where you've got policies defined. It's an easy place to start. And
Yeah.
the other is look where the operational processes are going to be critical to your value, right? So, find those environments where if I did automate, I
Yeah.
can feel comfortable. I can go back and show an auditor. Because a lot of people don't do things because they're worried about what about if the information, or what if I move it and I can't get it back? And so
Yeah.
we see consistently, and we'll move it off. By the way, if you want to run a proof of concept, we'll show you how you can move it back to the tier one within a short period of time. We do it within our own cloud environment, where when
Mm.
you shut down a VM, you can move it to the lower cost storage, and before you spin it back up again, you can move that all the information associated up to the high speed.
Yeah.
To actually show that you can do it, people gain more confidence and say, "Wow, I never could do that before." And not that I've just been able to create this new capability, I can bring it back. And we found that assurance of actually demonstrating that life cycle helps advance clients' ability to adopt it, because they can get past the naysayers very, very quickly. Now, we're pretty much at the end of time. I'll just toss it back to you quickly, Manuvir. Any last thoughts for our audience in terms of, you were pointing at where to start, but sort of how to build the journey?
Yeah, I think I want to end with just two quick comments, Kevin. One is, I think the other aspect of software defined that certainly we're working very hard on, that I think holds a lot of promise for the future is, you talked about I have data, and in some cases I don't quite know what value I'm going to extract from it tomorrow, right? So I think one of the key pillars of the software defined work is, how do I provide to you a new kind of storage, built-in software, which can be efficient at high enough scale that you can just throw all the data you're getting in there, and then post facto, whenever you decide to do, say, analytics on that data, it's there, and it's compatible with various analytics platforms, and you can just go do that, right? And you don't have to choose up front that, let me keep this data and throw that data away. So, these super scale data repositories spread across the globe, you can literally think of it as a very cheap and deep place to throw all your data in. And then later on, you have the opportunity to realize business value from these things, because that repository either is compatible with analytics or has analytics built into it that you can do on the data that's already there. So I think that's a real promising direction that we're also working on as part of software defined. And then the final comment I wanted to make was, Kevin, you talked about operations and the importance of processes, and I think this is why a company like EMC, we really look forward to working with partners like Dimension Data, because we know what we don't do and what we're not good at, right? So what my team and I are good at is, we can build those kinds of systems based on software, etc., that do what I would call some of this low-level stuff: how to materialize storage, how to be more efficient about storage. And we really don't have that experience and expertise into what kind of processes do people use, and how do you innovate there, right? And so I think that's that real opportunity, right? Like folks like yourself, that's what you do, right? And you figure out how to create high level business value. And I think our role is more, we provide you infrastructure and tools that help you do that part of it, which is probably where the real higher level value lies, right? So,
Oh, I appreciate that. And so, but last thought I'll leave the audience here with is a couple of things, right? One is, there's no reason not to. I think one of the big inhibitors we've heard people say is, I can't allow move data. I have to be audited. I have to be able to prove it. The key thing that, as you look at the cloud world, people have proven the cloud is more secure than their existing data center. You went back 2 years ago, that was a reason not to do cloud with security. Now it's because, and it's not more than, I have automated policies and I enforce them, and I can audit it and I can track it, and I can show every data movement that was there.
mhm,
And I think that sometimes that's lost, and
mhm,
people are with existing sort of older operational processes. Say if I move things and I lose control, reality is once you put under the domain of software, you establish control, because nothing happens that's not codified, that's
mhm,
not policy driven, and that's not auditable and traceable, because all that movement happens under the control of something and everything is caught, as opposed to it's manually done. And that, I think, is something that people need to sort of recognize, is the reasons not to do it of controls. Actually, control is better. The operational processes, that you can extend them long beyond what you have when you work with the ways we've approached it, or whether a client wants to make those investments themselves. And the third is the performance concerns are really, as you mentioned earlier, they're not there. It's not in the data path. It's in the management path. So you don't give up speed. If you're going out to very fast flash drives, you're not giving up speed for doing this. What you're actually is adding control and policies and optimizing investment. So with that, let me thank you, Manuvir Das, for taking your time and sharing your thoughts with us. I thank the audience for participating. Again, any questions, please don't hesitate to Dimension Data DD Hangouts hashtag. Thank you.
Thank you.